Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at chapter number 2 of Thomas Metzinger's book, The Ego Tunnel. I'll be relying heavily on my notes, so forgive me if I look down a lot. It is what it is. So we start out this chapter with tracing the meaning of the word consciousness. The Latin root is the word conscientia. Sorry for butchering it. I'm not a Latin speaker. So anyway, and Metzinger looks at the history of Western thought in order to frame the term conscientia or consciousness, and he makes out two main meanings that the term conscientia had in Western thought, and those are first is the aspect of it being some form of higher order knowledge, and the second one is it being an aspect of integration. So the second being the idea that consciousness is what sort of binds things together somehow into a comprehensive one. And so in this chapter, Metzinger tackles 6 central questions or problems that are important to tackle whenever you want to put together any sort of theory of consciousness. And they are: it is as important to understand the nature of those problems or questions as it is to, search answers for them. So what we will do is we will look at them one by one, and I will always start out clarifying what the actual question is. We will then visit Metzinger's line of argument, the way we used to do it in the last 2 sessions. I will present you with a concurrent list of hypotheses, and I will comment here and there if it's necessary. And I'll then at the very end of this video try to sum up what the answers to all those questions are. So there's timestamps in this video. If you don't want to, get down into the nitty-gritty with me, you can just skip ahead and go right to the conclusion. So let's get started. The one world problem encapsulates the question why and how are there various aspects of conscious experience organized into a single reality. I would like to look at 2 statements first. They are: in order for a world to appear to us, it has to be one world first. This appearance of one world is also called unity of consciousness. That's just a side note. It is the phenomenological fact that all the contents of our current experience are seamlessly correlated, forming a coherent whole, the world in which you live your life. We then get into the discussion or description of what is called the global neural correlate of consciousness, or global NCC for short. First, what is the global NCC? Metzinger offers a bunch of metaphors to describe the concept. So the following 3 statements are an attempt at describing what the NCC is. Dynamically, we can describe it, the NCC, as a coherent island made of densely coupled relations of cause and effect, emerging from the waters of a much less coherent flow of neural activity. Or we could adopt a neurocomputational perspective and look at the global NCC as something that results from information processing in the brain and hence functions as a carrier of information. We might envision it as an informational cloud hovering above a neurobiological substrate. The next four statements are then an attempt to describe the function of the NCC. The border of this information cloud is functional, not physical. Whatever information is within this cloud of firing neurons is conscious information. Whatever is within the cloud's boundary is part of our inner world. Whatever is outside of it is not part of our subjective reality. Personally, I do have questions, or question marks rather, regarding the statements 73 to 75, mainly because I take issue with him leaving out the aspect of the unconscious. It could be due to my own sort of programming, because I am a student of Carl Gustav Jung, as I've said many times before. To Carl Gustav Jung, the unconscious is an important, and if actually not more important, part than the conscious aspect. So in his mind, the human psyche is comprised of both conscious and unconscious aspects. And the unconscious has the tendency to greatly influence both our decision-making and our actions, while not being consciously accessible to us. So leaving out this aspect is a bit negligent here at this point, I feel. We then conclude with two more statements. Conscious experience can thus be seen as a special global property of the overall neural dynamics of your brain, a special form of information processing based on a globally integrated data format. As long as a sufficiently high degree of internal correlation and causation coupling allows this island or dancing micro-events in your brain to emerge, you live in a single reality. So this is not a surprise, considering that Metzinger is a materialist, and as such he must not only correlate but causally link conscious experience with the brain or with some aspects of the material brain, which is what he seems to be doing here. Metzinger then discusses several mental disorders that can potentially impinge on the unity of consciousness, which to my mind is hugely important. And it is perfectly rational to conclude that you can only have the experience of a single concurrent reality if both your brain and your sensory apparatus are working correctly. Some brains indeed have to work harder than others to even, for instance, have a coherent visual impression of reality. And I can give you a personal example. If you look at this image right here, this is what I see when I go for a walk with my dog Linus. Actually, this is not exactly what I see, because I was born cross-eyed. So what I actually see is this. I see a sort of second version of the path superimposed to the first one and slightly veering off to the right. So basically, my brain has to constantly subtract quite a lot of information that I take in. So with every visual I get, my brain has to do extra processing to sort of take away the double image that I constantly see. And naturally, when I'm more strained or tired, the double image becomes more pronounced. So that's just to show you that we are not born equal. So I commend Metzinger for exploring certain psychiatric and also neurological conditions. I think it's hugely important to understand what population any philosophy is catering to or targeting, you know. If it cannot cater to certain parts of the population because they simply don't have the preconditions that we, you know, presume they have, and therefore our philosophy that we might come up with somehow tendentially disenfranchises those populations. It is hugely important to make this transparent. The now problem is concerned with the question, why and how is experience organized into a present? We're going to look at two statements here. Everything is in the now. Whatever you experience it as happening at this moment. Both the perceived past and the conceived future are always embedded in a conscious model of the self, as remembering the past right now, or as planning the future at this very moment. I take slight issue with statement number 78, and here's why. While it might be true that experience always is in the now, we are hardly conscious of this. I think we are hardly conscious of the now. Nowness is, to my mind, something that is hugely difficult to be aware of. If you think about it, meditators practice for years to become aware of the now. Now, that's not to discount that that conscious experience isn't in the now. That's not what I'm saying, but I think that when he says whatever you experience it as happening at this moment, I think that's incorrect. I don't think we do. I think that we're 99% of the time, any normal human being is either reminiscing or anticipating, in my opinion. So they're constantly occupied with content that is either stored in their memory, or they're occupied with planning and imagining future scenarios, you know. So while this type of content, past or anticipated, is constantly being compared to the now, we are hardly aware of it. That's, I'm just saying. We have three more statements. Conscious information is exactly that information that must be made available for every single one of your cognitive capacities at the same time. Presence is a necessary condition for conscious experience. Nowness is an essential feature of consciousness. In terms of evolution, it makes sense to think that our sensory apparatus only serves up, you know, exactly the stuff that we should be preoccupied with in order to make the next decision, you know, or in order to survive and evolve. I want to point out here that Donald Hoffman, the cognitive psychologist, makes a similar claim. He argues that conscious beings have not evolved to perceive the world as it is, but they have evolved to perceive the world in a way that maximizes fitness payoffs, which is something that Metzinger seems to agree with here. So this is why we are only conscious of a sliver of the sensory information that we technically could be aware of. Interestingly, a side note here, having an autistic brain, that is exactly what is so debilitating about autism, is that our ability to filter sensory information seems to be greatly impaired, and our nervous system frequently goes into overload because of that impairment. So if you're curious about what it feels like to have autism, especially with regards to your sensory perception and experience, there's a whole playlist called Science of Autism on my channel. So it contains attempts and successful attempts, in my opinion, at simulating the autistic experience. So I was quite impressed by the simulations that people came up with. They're quite accurate, actually. We move on with 4 more statements. Remember, we're talking about nowness. So, and of course, it is an illusion, it being nowness. As modern day neuroscience tells us, we are never in touch with the present because neural information processing itself takes time. At this point, it becomes clear why philosophers speak about phenomenal consciousness or phenomenal experience. A phenomenon is an appearance. The sense of presence is an internal phenomenon created by the human brain. Yes, that makes complete sense to me. Back in 1973, Benjamin Libet was able to show that it takes the brain about 500 milliseconds to process a sensory stimulus. So it's almost like we're almost always 500 milliseconds behind the now, so to speak. We have 2 more statements. The ego tunnel is just the opposite of a God's eye view of the world. It has a now, a here, and a me being there now. Even giving a radically materialist view of mind and consciousness, one must concede that there is a complex physical property that, as far as we know, exists only in biological nervous systems on this planet. This new property is a virtual window of presence, and it is implemented in the brains of vertebrates and particularly of higher mammals. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the work of Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose at this instant. Particularly their work on microtubules. They have jointly hypothesized that conscious forming brain functions are based on microtubules, which are, minute structures in cells, and that they're based on macroscopic quantum effects that take place in those microtubules. In higher evolutionary stages, it is the microtubules of the brain neurons, but in principle, this mechanism can even apply to unicellular organisms with a cytoskeleton. So make of it what you will, but this to me personally makes more sense than his statement 88. So I think I know that he doesn't agree with Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's hypothesis. I think I read that somewhere. Not quite sure though. But anyway, it's worth looking at if you don't know about this. Now, the reality problem deals with the question, why do we naturally suppose that experience puts us into direct contact with the world, when science seems to tell us that those experiences are rather the product of temporally and spatially extended neural processes? I'm going to show you 8 statements in total with regards to this question. The pivotal question is how to get from a world model and a now model to exactly what you have as you are reading this, the presence of a world. The answer lies in the transparency of phenomenal representations. Recall that a representation is transparent if the system using it cannot recognize it as a representation. A model of the current moment is transparent if the brain has no chance of discovering that it is simply the result of information processing currently going on in itself. Transparency is not so much a question of the speed of information processing as of the speed of different types of processing, such as attention and visual perception, relative to each other. Thus, the answer to the question of why our conscious representation of the world are transparent, why we are constitutionally unable to recognize them as representations, and why this proved a viable, stable strategy for survival and procreation, probably is that the formation of meta-representations would not have been cost efficient. It would have been too expensive in terms of additional sugar we would have to find in our environment. So that pretty much harks back to what I said about Donald Hoffman's theory as well. Conscious information is exactly that set of information currently available in our brains to which we can deliberately direct our high-level attention. If the system in which these models are constructed is constitutionally unable to recognize both the world model and the current psychological moment as a model, then the system will of necessity generate a reality tunnel. So basically, I mean, we've talked about the aspect of transparency in videos past, and it makes perfect sense to think that the reason why we feel we are experiencing reality is because, you know, even the experience of a self is part of the processing going on in our brains. So the self being just a concept is a concept as well. So it is hardly possible for this concept to realize that they're basically a concept in a virtual sort of reality. Obviously, there are some of us that are able to realize this, so otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. But generally speaking, this is why we have this is why we feel that there is a reality being presented to us. The ineffability problem deals with the question, why does the content of experience seem to outstrip our ability to describe it? We start out by the statement, some aspects of the content of consciousness are ineffable. What does he mean by ineffable? He gives us a couple of examples. For example, you cannot explain to a blind man the redness of a rose. Or if the linguistic community you live in does not have a concept for a particular feeling, you may not be able to discover it in yourself or name it so as to share it with others. A third type of ineffability is formed by all those conscious states so fleeting you cannot form a memory trace of them. Brief flickers of the fringe of your subjective awareness, perhaps a hardly detectable color change or a mild fluctuation in some emotion, you lose the determinate value, the concrete qualitative suchness of the experience. So there are innumerable things in your life you can fathom only by experiencing them. There is a depth in pure perception that cannot be grasped or invaded by thought or language, and the ineffability problem is a serious challenge for a scientific theory of consciousness, or at least for finding all its neural correlates. Now, I mean, it's clear that he was able to show that some aspects of conscious experience are ineffable. And why is that so? Or why is that a problem for his project? Is that theory building relies, materialist theory building, one should say, relies on reduction, and we need to be able to create concepts and relate them to one another in order to build theories. So when you are unable to do that because your object of investigation, so to speak, in this case conscious experience, is so deep and vast and complex that it's too deep, vast and complex for you to even begin to measure, then that obviously is a challenge for theory building. He goes on to say, theories are built out of sentences and concepts, but if there are no concepts for certain objects in the domain of one theory, they cannot be mapped onto or reduced to concepts in the other. If we lack the necessary first-person knowledge, then we must define third-person criteria for these ineffable states. If there are no adequate phenomenological concepts, let's form adequate neurobiological concepts instead. So in essence, what he's saying is, if we cannot talk about certain experiences in phenomenological terms, what we're left to do is to sort of describe them in terms of neural correlates, you know. So instead of describing a certain redness to you by describing the experience or experiencing redness, we would have to point directly at sort of what brain regions get activated when we have the experience of redness, which is obviously a crutch. It's not as good as explaining the experience firsthand. We would need a new system of description, and it is debatable if we would want to sort of rely on that, you know, taking into consideration that what we're trying to describe will always be richer than our descriptions could ever be. Now, the evolution problem deals with the question, how did consciousness evolve and what is its biological function? We have 9 statements here. The basic brain features of sensory consciousness are preserved among mammals and exhibit strong homologies due to common ancestry. They, meaning animals, may not have language and conceptual thought, but it is likely that they all have sensations and emotions. They are clearly able to suffer. But since they do all this without verbal reports, it is almost impossible, to investigate this issue more deeply. Evolution is driven by chance, does not pursue a goal, and achieved what we now consider the continuous optimization of nervous systems in a blind process of hereditary variation and selection. There is a consensus among many leading figures in the consciousness community that at least one of the central functions of phenomenal experience is making information globally available to an organism. Conscious information is that subset of active information in the brain that requires monitoring because it's not clear which of your mental capacities you will need to access this information next. The general notion of global availability allows us to tell a convincing story about the evolution of consciousness. Here is my part of the story. Consciousness is a new kind of organ. Our virtual organs, which essentially he says, you know, consciousness is a virtual organ. Our virtual organs make information globally available to us, allowing us to access new facts and sometimes entirely new forms of knowledge. Now we can begin to see what the central evolutionary function of consciousness must have been. It makes classes of facts globally available for an organism and thereby allows it to attend to them, to think about them, and to react to them in a flexible manner that automatically takes the overall context into account. Phenomenal states are neurocomputational organs that make survival relevant information globally available within a window of presence. Yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. I mean, there's nothing we can say or contend, you know, so. The last of the 6 problems, the who problem, deals with the question, what is the entity that has all these experiences? Now there's a whole bunch of statements concerning this question. Consciousness is always bound to an individual first-person perspective. It is a subjective phenomenon. In a deep and indisputable way, your inner world truly is not just someone's inner world, but your inner world, a private realm of experience that only you have direct access to. This, of course, poses the huge problem for science and or for materialist theory making when wanting to research consciousness. Well, you know, one of the hallmarks of science is objectivity. So what do you do if your subject of investigation, if your object of investigation is per se considered subjective? He goes on to say, the orthodox view holds that scientific research can be conducted only on objects exhibiting properties that are at least in principle observable to all of us. Brain states, on the other hand, are observable. Brain states also clearly have what philosophers call representational content. So this brings us back to the topic we discussed in a video past, which is sort of like the question of correlation versus causation. So the materialist philosopher will try to correlate experience, conscious experience, with a brain state, and he will, you know, and he's okay. I mean, that's enough to him, and he, of course, implies that there is causation. So, and that's what, for instance, idealists contend with. The stance of the materialist is that it is sufficient to show correlation in order to monitor brain states, i.e. to monitor brain states is sufficient in order to explain conscious experience. He goes on to say, to form a successful theory of consciousness, we must match first-person phenomenal content to third-person brain content. Is the existence of an experiencing self a necessary component of consciousness? I don't think it is, for one thing, because there seem to be selfless forms of conscious experience. Now this opens a whole other can of worms. For one, we could argue that, you know, if that is so, then, you know, AI which is not only likely to self-organize, no pun intended, but also it could be considered conscious if we went down that route. So we would be faced with a whole host of decisions, both legal and ethical and whatever. I mean, it's clearly something that we will have to deal with, you know, as AI becomes more pronounced. On the upside, this also, I think, opens the door for the idealist route, in my opinion. If consciousness does not hinge on having a self that originates in the brain, then, in my opinion, the question of primacy of consciousness is sort of wide open again. But it's just a feeling. Metzinger takes this further when he says, mystics of all cultures and all times have reported deep spiritual experiences in which no self was present, and some of them too stopped using the pronoun I. Human consciousness is characterized by various forms of inwardness, all of which influence one another. First, it is an internal process in the nervous system. Second, it creates the experience of being in a world. Third, the virtual window of presence gives us temporal internality, a now, but the deepest form of inwardness was the creation of an internal self-world border. Yes, I agree. Can't contend that. So that was a lot of information in a relatively short time. I'm always trying to keep this as short as possible, these videos. So. But anyway, I think it merits a sort of summary, and what I'll do is I'll prompt you the original question for each of those 6 questions, and I attempted to answer it in Metzinger's terms. Let's start with the first one. So, why and how are the various aspects of conscious experience organized into a single reality? Well, unity of consciousness is brought about by what is called the global neural correlate of consciousness, or global NNC for short. Which isn't exactly an answer to the why, but to the how. Why and how is experience organized into a present? We need to be able to make informed decisions in order to survive, which is why our experience is anchored in a now and lets us consciously experience a portion of the information that technically could be available to us. Why do we naturally suppose that experience puts us into direct contact with the world when science seems to tell us that those experiences are rather the product of temporally and spatially extended neural processes? The formation of meta-representations would not have been cost efficient in terms of evolution. Why does the content of experience seem to outstrip our ability to describe it? Actually, we don't know why, but it does seem to, and that is a problem for theory building. How did consciousness evolve, and what is its biological function? Consciousness evolved from the continuous optimization of nervous systems. Its central evolutionary function is to make information globally available to an organism, allowing it to make necessary decisions for survival. What is the entity that has all these experiences? The short answer is there is none. What we perceive as an entity, as I or self, is a byproduct of processing sensory data. So to finish my review of this chapter, I would like to read you a short paragraph. How to comprehend subjectivity is the deepest puzzle in consciousness research. In order to overcome it, we must understand how the conscious self was born into the tunnel, how nature managed to evolve a centered model of reality, creating inner worlds that not only appear, but that appear to someone. We must understand how the consciousness tunnel turned into an ego tunnel. And that is what is going to be discussed in the coming chapters. If you've watched so far, I commend you. You're obviously interested in consciousness studies. If I was able to sort of water your mouth a little bit to read this book yourselves, then I feel I've done my job. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye.